Do you believe in God?
I believe there's some explanation for this universe, which you might call God.
They told us the Bible we know was complete, final, and unquestionable. But what if that was a lie? Behind centuries of edits, censorship, and power plays, there are older scriptures the church never wanted the world to see. Texts written before the canon, raw and dangerous, stripped of polish, and filled with ideas that could destroy the version of Christianity we were taught to trust. Now Elon Musk has stepped in. He says this original Bible has been buried on purpose, hidden from ordinary people. And if its contents are revealed, it could rip apart everything we think we know about God, humanity, and the future of faith. What's inside doesn't just challenge belief. It threatens to rewrite it completely. Subtopic 1. The Forbidden Library. Although it might seem impossible to believe, the idea of an original biblical text being lost to history is nothing extraordinary. Being the curious entrepreneur who refuses to accept conventional wisdom about anything, it's no surprise that Elon Musk, who recently expressed growing interest in Christian principles, would eventually direct his analytical mind toward discovering sacred writings that were deliberately excluded by the early Christian communities nearly 2,000 years ago from what now became the official biblical canon. It all started when Jordan Peterson's Bible series titled The Gospels started trending. During their conversations, something didn't add up.
What you want to do is have it behind
Become
you.
my follower.
Like,
Because that's what he says.
Well, then it might even push you forward in the right direction, right?
That's what he says to Peter, too.
Yeah, right.
The scholars they consulted revealed that St. Paul, who wrote nearly half the New Testament, was killed by Emperor Nero in 65 AD, barely 3 decades after Christ's death. This timeline meant all his letters were written before then, and since some quoted material from the Gospels, those books were already circulating widely. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. What most people don't realize is that the biblical canon didn't appear overnight as a divinely ordained collection. Instead, it grew gradually over centuries, with early church communities in different regions maintaining significantly different lists of accepted books. The Book of Revelation, the final piece of the New Testament puzzle, wasn't written until 96 AD. Even among these early church authorities, several books that eventually made it into the New Testament remained disputed for centuries. The letters to the Hebrews, James, and even the Book of Revelation itself were questioned by major church leaders as to whether they were really written by the apostles. The idea that there was an early consensus about which books belonged in the Bible is simply historically inaccurate. However, from that point forward, the Christian scribes worked tirelessly to collect and preserve what they believed were authentic writings, but the original scrolls were already deteriorating quickly. Churches across the empire needed complete sets immediately, so thousands of copies were produced and distributed. This was happening during an era when no central authority existed to verify which books were real and which were pure forgeries. So it took centuries of theological warfare to establish the biblical collection we know today. According to documents Elon Musk has been studying, by 95 AD, just 1 year before Revelation appeared, Clement of Rome, a disciple of the Apostle Peter, already possessed 8 texts that would later become part of the New Testament. A decade later, Polycarp acknowledged 15 books as sacred. 70 years after that, Irenaeus authenticated 21 books, while Hippolytus confirmed 22. And it went on and on. These approved writings became the Muratorian canon. But the unsettling question remains: what happened to all the books they rejected? Hundreds of Gospels, letters, and prophetic books were circulating in early Christian communities. The Gospel of Thomas, Book of Enoch, the Acts of Paul, the Apocalypse of Peter, and dozens more. To Musk, the Teresive collection of rejected texts represents fragments of the real original Bible, not the sanitized version we inherited. If hundreds of Gospels and letters were circulating in the 1st century, Musk argues, then the original Christianity was far messier, rawer, and more diverse. The question isn't what made it into the official canon, it's what they deliberately left out. The reality about these lost Gospels is more complex than most people realize. While some texts like the Gospel of Thomas may preserve early sayings traditions, others like the Gospel of Judas were clearly written centuries later as theological fiction. The problem now was, ordinary believers had no way to distinguish between authentic apostolic writings and the others. They had to trust church leaders who claimed to have special authority to make these determinations without knowing if those leaders had their own agenda. Because of this crisis, Musk explained that the first great controversy over the original Bible started sometime in the 2nd century. Desperate to prevent the complete fragmentation of Christianity, Eusebius, the historian and bishop of Caesarea, wrote exhaustive histories attempting to justify which books deserved to be a part of the scripture. Now, he organized the books into 3 categories he termed canonical, disputed, and rejected. The canonical books were those approved by the earliest church leaders who had personally met witnesses of Jesus and the apostles. The disputed books were endorsed by only some of the earliest church fathers, and not everyone agreed whether they were authentic or false, including writings like the Book of Revelation. The rejected books were those exposed as fraudulent by the earliest leaders who knew the apostles personally. Then, St. Jerome later provided additional clarity by translating the approved texts into Latin, and his selections became the foundation for the biblical texts we read today. But here's what still keeps most scholars awake. Jerome, being from Bethlehem, had access to Hebrew and Greek manuscripts that no longer exist. What if the real teachings of Jesus were already being systematically eliminated by the time Jerome started his translation work? Elon Musk poses the obvious question that no one wants to face. If so many texts were in circulation when the apostles were alive, who decided which ones we're allowed to read today? And why should we trust that they made the right choices? The answer will shock you to your bones. Topic 2. The Emperor's Gamble. The blood was still fresh on Constantine's armor when he made the decision that would reshape Christianity forever. October 28, 312 AD. The Battle of Milvian Bridge had just ended, with his enemy Maxentius drowning in the Tiber River. And Constantine was convinced that the Christian God had given him victory after he saw a vision of a cross of light with the words, "In this sign conquer," before the battle. Then he converted to Christianity. But before this happened, Rome had waged a brutal war against Christians for 3 centuries. Under Emperor Nero, they were burned alive as human torches. Under Decius and Diocletian, fierce campaigns were pushed to destroy Christian communities and burn their sacred scriptures. The carnage was so fierce that historians believe entire collections of authentic apostolic writings vanished forever during these persecutions. However, Constantine's conversion wasn't really about faith, but about power. The man who claimed divine vision before battle wasn't even baptized until he was dying 25 years later. For most of his reign, he remained a worshipper of Sol Invictus, the sun god. He simply saw that Christianity was becoming the dominant religious force in the empire, and aligning himself with it would surely give him huge political advantages. Musk sees Constantine's move as brilliant, but terrifying at the same time. Constantine didn't really convert to Christianity, Musk explains. He acquired it. Like any intelligent businessman, he saw where the market was heading and positioned himself to take the largest share and control it. But here's an interesting truth. Since he wasn't fully in, he did all that was needed to preserve what we now call the New Testament. Then, by 325 AD, growing divisions among Christians threatened Constantine's vision of ruling the whole of Italy. He couldn't have competing Christian factions undermining his authority, so he created the Council of Nicaea to settle these disputes once and for all. He was simply deciding which version of Christianity would survive and which would be eliminated forever. The Council of Nicaea went on to establish the Nicene Creed, but more importantly, it established the precedent that political authorities could determine religious truth. The bishops who attended weren't independent theologians, they were Constantine's guests, dependent on his favor for their positions and their lives. The first complete list of the 27 New Testament books we know today didn't actually appear until 367 AD, in a letter written by Athanasius of Alexandria. This was decades after Constantine's death, and over 40 years after the Council of Nicaea. But here's the question that should terrify Christians. How many authentic apostolic writings were deliberately excluded because they didn't align with Constantine's political agenda? We know that dozens of Gospels and letters were circulating in the 4th century. We know that some claimed apostolic authorship and were accepted by large Christian communities. But we also know that Constantine and his bishops had the power to declare any inconvenient text heretical and order its destruction. The scary reality is that the Christianity Constantine legalized might be completely different from what Jesus actually taught. From Musk's perspective, Constantine's Bible wasn't about preserving divine revelation, as it were. It was about programming a religion that supported his unquenching thirst for imperial power. The books that made it into the Bible might represent not divine truth, but what was politically convenient. Well, Constantine's political Christianity was just the beginning. Over the next 1,000 years, an army of monks would work tirelessly to ensure that only approved versions of these texts survived. And what they did to preserve certain books while eliminating others will shock you. Subtopic 3. The Scribes' Conspiracy. Somewhere in the monasteries of medieval Europe, something sinister was going on. Behind those walls were men and women who had given their lives to their religion, dedicated to copying the world's most sacred texts by hand in special rooms called the scriptoria. From the late 4th century onward, monastic communities became the gatekeepers of Christian literature. In their scriptoriums, monks worked by candlelight with quill and ink, producing thousands of manuscript copies. But the way Musk saw it, these medieval scriptoriums were like corrupt data centers, where every hand copy stood a high risk of fatal errors. Imagine if every time you saved a file, some random programmer could edit the code, Musk explains. That's what happened to the Bible for over 1,000 years. With no version control, no backups, and no way to verify authenticity, the original source code of Christianity was completely compromised. And that was the exact mountain they faced. Copying thousands and thousands of words by hand in dimly lit rooms led to omissions, duplicated lines, and misspellings. Some scribes went as far as making edits in the texts, sometimes for clarity, sometimes for doctrinal sake. But everything changed in the 12th century when Peter Lombard wrote his book titled Sentences, a theological handbook that became the standard reference for Christian doctrine. But Lombard's work drew heavily from texts that had previously been classified as heretical or doubtful. Suddenly, books that early church fathers had rejected were being treated as authoritative sources of Christian teaching. Thanks to Lombard's influence, the Church gradually embraced what became known as the deuterocanonical or apocryphal books, writings like Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, and others that had been excluded from the original biblical canon. These texts were now being copied alongside established scripture and treated with equal authority. The medieval church had effectively expanded the Bible to include books that the earliest Christians had rejected. But the vast majority of believers had absolutely no idea this had happened. Biblical manuscripts were rare and expensive, accessible only to church authorities and wealthy scholars. Common people depended entirely on what priests told them the Bible said. As said earlier, these monks didn't just copy text mechanically. They were also trained to correct passages that seemed to conflict with approved doctrine. This happened so much that it was beginning to seem like a coordinated campaign to rebrand the truth and ensure that only church-approved versions of Christian truth survived into the modern era. Every manuscript that passed through monastic scriptoriums was potentially altered to support the institutional version of Christianity. But this was about to face its greatest challenge. A German monk and professor was beginning to smell something fishy in the church's manipulation of sacred texts, and his investigation would expose centuries of deception. His name was Martin Luther. Interestingly, what Martin Luther discovered was so shocking that even he couldn't imagine the full scope of what had been hidden from believers. Could one man's search for truth really bring down an institution that had controlled information for over 1,000 years? The revolution that was coming would tear apart the careful web of control that monasteries had woven around Christian truth. But it would also reveal that the corruption ran deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. Subtopic 4. The Reformers' Revelation. The strikes of the hammer echoed through Wittenberg as Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the castle church door on October 31, 1517. He wanted every scholar who stepped into the church to at least have a look at it. But those weren't just complaints about church corruption. They were the opening shots in a war over the most dangerous question in Christianity. What did the original biblical texts actually say? Luther was full of rage because he had discovered that the church was using books as scripture that had never been accepted by the earliest Christians. The deuterocanonical books that medieval monasteries had quietly added to the biblical canon were being used to justify practices that contradicted the clear teaching of authentic apostolic writings. So how had these questionable texts gained such authority? But Luther's discovery was a lot bigger than this. He had gained access to Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that were older and more reliable than anything the Roman Church was using. These manuscripts revealed that key passages used to support papal authority, purgatory, and salvation through works were either mistranslated or completely absent from the earliest texts. The church leaders were utterly terrified. If people could read the biblical text for themselves in their own language, they would discover that much of what the church taught wasn't based on apostolic writings at all. It was based on medieval editions, mistranslations, and sometimes outright fabrications. When Luther was declared an outlaw by the church, he embarked on the most dangerous translation project in history. He wasn't just converting Latin into German, he was going back to the oldest available manuscripts to recover what the biblical authors had actually written. Instead of accepting the church's expanded biblical canon, he returned to the original 66 books that had been accepted by the earliest Christian communities. He translated the deuterocanonical books separately, clearly marking them as helpful for reading, but not foundational for doctrine. The invention of the printing press even further amplified Luther's work. For the first time in history, identical copies of biblical texts could be mass-produced and distributed widely. This technological revolution didn't just spread Luther's translation, it dangerously multiplied the number of people who could develop their own interpretations of Scripture, leading to an explosion of Protestant denominations. By 1534, Luther had completed his translation of the entire biblical text, and the impact was immediate and devastating to church authority. People who could now read Scripture for themselves discovered that much of what they had been taught was nowhere to be found in the original texts. The spread of Luther's biblical translation across Europe triggered a whole literacy revolution. People learned to read specifically so they could study Scripture for themselves. and what they found challenged every assumption about Christian doctrine. But the Church's response was swift and brutal. John Huss, who strongly supported Luther's teachings, was expelled and his followers executed. Michael Sattler was tortured and killed for promoting biblical authority over church tradition. William Tyndale was burned at the stake for translating the biblical text into English. The list goes on and on. Realizing his own life was now in danger, Martin Luther hid at Wartburg Castle. What you might not realize is just how closely the canon debates were tied to executions and political power. Religious authorities didn't just disagree with these reformers theologically. They see challenges to biblical authority as threats to their political control. Why should average people read the sacred writings for themselves? It was really a matter of life and death. Luther and other reformers were using textual criticism and historical analysis to expose centuries of manipulation, while church authorities were using violence to protect their version of Christian truth. But Musk took it even further. He raises the uncomfortable question that even Luther couldn't answer. Every reformer thinks they found the original truth, but if all of them disagreed on which books mattered, then none of them actually had access to the real source code. Luther may have been a brilliant disruptor, but he was still working with corrupted data. John Calvin himself went on to develop the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, the belief that the original manuscripts contained no errors whatsoever. Calvin's followers began to see the 66 books as perfect and complete, rejecting any suggestion that authentic apostolic writings might have been lost or suppressed. By 1826, Protestant Bible societies stopped printing the deuterocanonical books altogether, returning to the original 66-book canon that the earliest Christians had recognized. At this point, you might be wondering, if the Church had been wrong about which books belonged in the biblical canon, what else might they have been wrong about? What other authentic apostolic writings might be waiting to be rediscovered? The answer would come from the most unexpected place imaginable. Subtopic 5. The Dead Sea Scrolls. It was 1947, and a young Bedouin shepherd searching for his lost goat near Qumran had just made the discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about the biblical text. But what he found in that cave, inside an old clay pot, wasn't just ancient manuscripts. It was proof that the Church had been hiding the truth about the original biblical canon for nearly 2,000 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't just old books. They were time capsules of ancient Jewish groups known as the Essenes from the 1st century, containing the actual biblical manuscripts that Jewish communities were reading when Jesus was alive. The Hebrew biblical texts found at Qumran were over 95% identical to modern translations. Books like Isaiah showed virtually identical text to manuscripts created over 1,000 years later, proving that Jewish scribes maintained extraordinary accuracy in copying sacred texts. But that remaining 5% were spelling errors and theological differences that would have massive implications for Christian doctrine. Now, more disturbing still, the Qumran community had preserved several of the deuterocanonical books that Protestant churches had rejected: the Book of Sirach, the Letter of Jeremiah, and portions of other texts that early Jewish communities clearly considered sacred scripture. But if these ancient Jews regarded these books as holy scripture, why did later Christians reject them? You see, the inclusion of apocryphal works among the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrates that these texts were valued and studied in ancient Jewish communities, even if they weren't considered equal to Torah or the prophetic writings. Their presence suggests a more nuanced understanding of religious authority than later Christian debates about canonical versus non-canonical texts would suggest. So, if authentic 1st century Jewish communities possessed sacred texts that aren't in our biblical canon, then our understanding of what constitutes original scripture may be fundamentally wrong. The Church might have a lot of explaining to do. To Elon Musk, The Dead Sea Scrolls was the perfect smoking gun that the original Bible was far larger and more diverse than any modern church wants to admit. Here we have first-century religious communities with access to books and letters that our supposedly complete Bible doesn't even mention, Musk argues. If these people were reading sacred texts we've never even heard of, then our Bible isn't original. It's a heavily edited compilation. Even more shocking is what the scrolls reveal about the process of canon formation. The Qumran community didn't have a fixed biblical canon at all. They possessed a fluid collection of sacred writings that included books we recognize, books we've rejected, and books that have been completely lost to history. But perhaps most significant of all, the Dead Sea Scrolls prove that alternative versions of biblical books were circulating in the 1st century. Some scrolls contain expanded versions of canonical books with additional chapters and verses. Others contain completely different versions of familiar stories with altered theological emphases. The terrifying question is this: if multiple versions of biblical books were available in the 1st century, how do we know that the Church selected the right versions for inclusion in the official canon? What if the versions that were suppressed actually preserved more authentic traditions than the ones that survived? The Dead Sea Scrolls have opened a door that the Church can never shut again. They've raised the possibility that authentic apostolic writings are still waiting to be discovered in desert caves and ancient ruins. But the most disturbing realization is that the Church has always known this. They've had access to archaeological evidence and manuscript discoveries that prove the biblical canon is incomplete. Yet they've continued to teach that the 66 or 73 books represent the complete revelation of God to humanity. 3 billion people today call themselves Christians, but they may be following a religion that bears little resemblance to what Jesus actually taught. The biblical text, available in over 400 English translations, derived from more than 20,000 ancient manuscript fragments, represents one of the most carefully documented texts in human history. Yet, that same evidence proves that our biblical canon is incomplete, altered, and possibly corrupted beyond recognition. The rejected New Testament books, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Acts of Paul, were dismissed by church authorities not because they were proven false, but because they challenged institutional power structures. The rejected Old Testament books face similar problems. The Book of Tobit, 2nd Maccabees, and the Wisdom of Solomon were excluded from Protestant Bibles not because they were historically unreliable, but because they supported practices like prayers for the dead and salvation through charitable works that challenged what the official biblical canon teaches. But the Dead Sea Scrolls have shattered the Church's narrative about biblical authority. These manuscripts prove that ancient Jewish communities possessed a much larger collection of sacred texts than modern biblical canons recognize. They had books we've never heard of, alternative versions of books we think we know. What's most significant is Elon Musk's recognition that this isn't just a historical or theological issue. It's a pattern that repeats throughout human civilization. Powerful institutions consistently suppress information that threatens their authority. Musk sees the suppression of these texts as part of a larger pattern he's witnessed throughout human history. From governments censoring inconvenient data to tech platforms controlling information flow. He explains that the same instinct that drives modern institutions to hide uncomfortable truths is what drove the early church to bury the real original Bible. They knew that if people had access to the complete picture, their version of reality would collapse. The truth is somewhere out there, buried in desert caves and hidden in ancient libraries, waiting for technology and human curiosity to set it free. And when that happens, it may not just change Christianity, it may change everything. So what do you think? Are these suppressed texts the authentic foundation of human spirituality that these institutions have hidden for centuries? Or should we trust that religious authorities have preserved exactly only what we need to know? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section.